So, Jordan Peterson collects Soviet art. Did you know this?
Here, this is a catalog of all my art.
Of your art?
Well, art I bought.
You're kidding me.
No. Hundreds of pieces. I collected it after the Soviet Union collapsed, mostly online.
That's so interesting. And not only does he collect it, he has somewhere between 250 to 400 pieces of socialist realist painting, Soviet memorabilia, and so on and so forth. I know more about socialist realism than I do Jordan Peterson, but the little that I do know about Jordan Peterson leads me to believe that it makes perfect sense that he collects late Soviet art. But I don't think it's for the reasons that his critics say that he does. It's not for the reasons that his followers say that he does, and it's not even, if I may, for the reasons that Peterson himself cites. I haven't been able to find a lot written about his collection. The few articles that I was able to find usually fall into one of two categories. They either portray Peterson as this borderline demonic far-right ideologue that of course is drawn to totalitarian art because he himself harbors a sweet spot for dictatorship, or articles that depict him as this messianic, prophet-like figure that is the defender of the Western civilization and who is drawn to Soviet art as to the objects that are living reminders of the kind of atrocities the human animal is capable of when marching under the banner of communism. Peterson himself, when talking about his collection of Soviet art, usually says two things. First, he says, it started as a joke.
It was so funny. I just couldn't stand the irony of this, the world's most capitalistic enterprise. It's eBay, right? It's just free trade. That's all it is. Now I could buy Soviet artifacts. That was so funny. So I could buy like Karl Marx posters on eBay, discounted.
And then the second thing he says is that for him, in these socialist realist paintings, in these Soviet paintings, what he sees is this battle, which is very on brand for Peterson, but he sees as this sort of battle between art and ideology. And what he says, which is like a really romantic idea, he says with time, art wins.
They're a battleground between art, because the quality of the artist is extraordinarily high, and propaganda. And you can see the art, which is a much powerful force than propaganda. You can see the art and the propaganda struggling on the canvas, and over time you can see the art winning.
Okay, so I don't think it's a joke, right? I mean, the irony of buying Lenin off of eBay does not escape me. It is kind of funny, but it's not 400 times funny. And Peterson has a very large collection, right? So nothing is 400 times funny. And then I don't think that a socialist realist art collection is about art, really. I don't think a socialist realist art collection is about ideology. And to me, less than a battle site, socialist realism is an origin of a cultural and intellectual tradition that is extremely prominent today and that Jordan Peterson is one of the most outspoken critics of. And so this is what I want to talk about and think about today, because I find it so interesting. Because for better or worse, through the figure of Jordan Peterson, socialist realism has found its way into our contemporary conversation, and I think it's interesting to think about what it could possibly mean. From the few photos and videos that I was able to find of Peterson's collection, it looks like he has quite a variety of objects in his possession currently. There is one poster that comes up again and again of this Komsomol child with an open book of Lenin's childhood, which was like a mandatory reading for all Soviet children. And then behind that little Komsomol boy, there's a statue of young Lenin, and it says, "Learn like Lenin." It also looks like he has a large painting of Lenin's proclamation of the power of the Soviet in 1917. It is this sort of really dramatic painting of Lenin addressing the crowd. You can see Trotsky and Stalin there in the background. He says that he also has several paintings that are more impressionistic, that are of Gagarin, Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man who successfully orbited the Earth in 1961. It also looks like he has a few paintings that have less ideological charges, like he has a painting of a wedding party and a painting of like an office worker of some kind. And again, when he talks about his collection, he continuously highlights just how technically proficient those objects are, just how technically talented the Soviet artists were, which is true. So what do I mean when I say that the Socialist Realist art collection is not about art? Well, I say that because Socialist Realism initially was not conceived as a painterly movement. It was born as a literary movement. If you look at those photographs from 1934, from the first Congress of Soviet Writers, where the formula for Socialist Realism was born, right? The Socialist Realist work of art is a truthful, historically specific representation of reality in its revolutionary development, right? Like that description of what Socialist Realism is. If you look at the sort of decorations of that event, you will find portraits of writers, and not just of any writers, of just contemporary writers, but of Russian classics. You will find Tolstoy, you will find Pushkin, Lermontov, Chernyshevsky, of course, Gogol is right there. And then right next to a giant portrait of Stalin, you will find a giant portrait of Gorky, who's also a writer. Russia has always been very logocentric and very much connected to its literary practices. The role of a writer and a poet in Russia has always been of extreme importance and of extreme gravity. So Socialist Realism is more about text. And more than just text, Socialist Realism is about a story, and it's about a very particular story. In 1981, Katerina Clark, who's a scholar of Russian literature, published her groundbreaking, honestly field-defining book, Soviet novel, History as Ritual. And in this book, she makes a series of really important and impressive and exciting discoveries. But the few things that I want to share with you is that first, she argues against this idea of Socialist Realism's ahistoricity, right? Again, this idea that Socialist Realism was just this inorganic thing that was prescribed by the ideologues, right? She kind of shows Socialist Realism's roots in broader history of Russian literature. So that's one first thing she does. And kind of, again, if we think back to those portraits, we see that Socialist Realism as a movement kind of also saw itself belonging to that literary tradition. Okay. Second, she says that, and this is what she writes, this is really funny. She writes, after reading dozens and dozens of these unreadable texts, like she calls them unreadable, poor Socialist Realism, they are kind of hard to read. But after reading all these unreadable texts, what she finds is a single plot, what she calls a master plot, which is basically a formula for plot development that every Socialist Realist novel was meant to follow. With little deviations, she says, more or less, all Socialist Realist stories, all Socialist Realist novels follow this outline. And I don't remember exactly like how it goes. I'll show you on the screen. But that's not the point. The point is that it is always a narrative structure that is striving towards success, striving towards the building of communism, right? Striving toward building of that utopia. And so paintings then, artworks, are meant to highlight narrative points within that story. So again, paintings give form and feeling to those narrative points. Do you see the difference? And again, if that is true, which it is, it makes perfect sense that Peterson is drawn to this kind of art because of his own interest in stories, right? His ARC conference is all about telling a better story. He puts emphasis on the role of narrative in our understanding of the world and us in it. And so a Socialist Realist art collection is less about art and more about the story. Now, what kind of story? And here I just wanted to take a small aside and talk about Gagarin, who Jordan Peterson says he has an impressionistic portrait of. In 1961-62, he becomes the first man to successfully orbit the Earth and come back. And upon his return, of course, he goes into this grand tour of the Soviet Union, and many people ask him different things. And government, of course, uses his persona and this achievement for its own ideological purposes. And one of the questions that he is often asked, Gagarin is often asked, is whether or not he saw God up there. He says, no, I didn't see God, and some say, well, maybe Gagarin didn't see God, but God saw Gagarin. But anyway, so there is this really adorable and wonky poster of Gagarin, flying over the earth and exclaiming that there is no God, which really plays along this irreligious, atheistic program of the Soviet government. The reason I'm telling this story is that despite this inclination towards irreligiosity, socialist realist story, right? Socialist realist narrative is a religious narrative. And so what I want to say is that a collection of socialist realist art is not about ideology, it is about religion. And it would make perfect sense for Jordan Peterson to collect religious art because of his overall interest in legend and in archetypes and the good versus evil, chaos versus order narratives. But he doesn't collect religious art, although maybe you can say that his First Nations collection, that I know very little about, so I'm not talking about it, is kind of more religious, mythological. But this larger collection of his, I think it's larger, is about communist art, right? That is specifically irreligious. Well, what is the difference between ideology and religion? Ideology is concerned with social and political organization. Religion concerns itself with the transcendental, the sacred. It is invested in an ultimate meaning. And if we take those two distinctions seriously, we begin to understand that socialist realism, the artistic doctrine of Soviet Union, is closer to religion than it is to ideology. And it's not at all an original claim. There are several books written about it, but one that always comes to mind for me is a 1957 text by Andrei Sinyavsky, who was writing at the time under a pen name of Abram, who writes this text called What is Socialist Realism? And it is a satire. It is written in very biting, funny, bitter, humorous tone, which a lot of Soviet humor is a little bitter. But he basically describes the Soviet ideology as a kind of religion. So he says, socialist realism is goal-oriented, oriented towards the building of socialism, of communism. Socialist realism demands your faith, first and foremost. Again, truthful, historically specific representation of art in its revolutionary development. You need to believe that we will arrive at that end point of that revolutionary development. He also says that inevitability of communist utopia is the main artistic criteria for all art. He says that socialist realism as a worldview does not allow you to look for alternatives, because if you look for alternatives, if you look for heaven on earth, that means you don't have it yet. Whereas within the socialist realist trajectory, right, trajectory of revolutionary development, you already have it. And this idea of building of heaven on earth, he says, is at the crux of socialist realist project. Okay, but what would be the problem with that? Well, then Tertz highlights contradictions that you find in socialist realism upon its application to life. He says, it is interesting because we are working towards abolishing prison and bringing freedom into our country. But here we are imprisoning more than ever. He says, we are trying to abolish death, but here we are prosecuting and executing left and right. And this kind of misalignment that Tertz highlights produces, at its best, irony in the population. And irony as a feeling that is produced by an encounter of socialist realism at the time of its production is interesting because irony as a sentiment could be said to have built the bridge between modern and the postmodern era. And so this almost religious quality of socialist realism actually carries us from modern into postmodern time. So a collection of socialist realist art is not about art, it is about text and about the story. A collection of socialist realist art is not about ideology, it's about religion, it's about faith. And collection of socialist realist art is less a battleground between art and ideology and more an origin of postmodernism, which Jordan Peterson is one of the most outspoken critics of. And that's very interesting. The question of whether socialist realism is a modern art or a postmodern art is a bit of a niche debate. But the stakes of this debate is the answer to the question of whether socialist realism should be approached as just a relic of the past or as a source of cultural intellectual tradition that is influencing our contemporary moment. And socialist realism is a little annoying because you can make an argument with equal degree of success that it is modern or postmodern. What do we know about modernism? Modernism loves grand narratives, a single idea that explains the world around you. Socialist realism does have that in the sort of Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Modernism loves clear hierarchies. So does socialist realism. It is very clear that we have very stark divisions between good and bad, between powerful and powerless, between oppressed and oppressor. Modernism is interesting in building a new world, in building new material reality, following its conceptions of beauty and freedom and different ideological values, doesn't matter which one, but it's interested in building, right? And so socialist realism, so much of socialist realism is about industrial production, it is about material improvement of life, right? In our striving for a socialist future. Okay. And modernism is interested in form, right? So modernism usually is known for its formal experimentation. And again, so is socialist realism, right? It has a very clear idea of what forms it needs to adhere to in order to, again, meet its telos, meet its goal. On the other hand, you can with equal success argue that socialist realism is a postmodern art movement. What do we know about postmodernism? Postmodernism is suspicious of grand narratives. And in a way, socialist realism produces that suspicion, right? If you again think of Sinyavsky and Abram Tertz's text, he writes about this generation of irony between people who are encountering socialist realism, right? There's this gap between the transcendental Soviet project of communist utopia and the reality on the ground. And he says because of this gap, there is a kind of mistrust that is being generated. Instead of clear hierarchies that we find in modernism, postmodernism is interested in more like horizontal, spread out webs of relations rather than hierarchical relations. And in a way, within the Soviet system, it was more about knowing how to navigate these horizontal webs of social relations rather than following a clearly outlined bureaucratic procedure. It was about who you know, who you can bribe, who can, bring you a contraband, who can put in a word with your boss. It was more of a dynamic, multilateral system rather than this very clear-cut hierarchy. And then finally, of course, instead of building a new world, postmodernism is interested in subjugating reality to its ideas, which precisely what socialist realism is doing. And instead of working with form like modernism does, postmodernism shifts towards a greater focus on text and on narrative, on ideas. And so you see it's a little frustrating because you can seemingly make an argument either way, but I think maybe the takeaway idea could be that in theory, socialist realism was a modernist art movement, but in its application, in the way that it manifested itself, it was postmodern. Whenever Peterson speaks about postmodernism, he usually cites neo-Marxism, and he usually does that in the context of talking about identity politics and all that sort of stuff. But what's interesting is that these postmodern threads can be detected within the kind of art that he collects, right? Which I think is very interesting. In a blog post about his art collection, Peterson addresses the fact that he does not collect art from the Third Reich, right? And he says that there's something about the evil of the German art from 1930s that is more palpable. But objects from the Soviet Union are more subtle. The darkness in them is more subdued. And that is true, I think. Whenever you are encountering Soviet objects, Soviet texts, Soviet art, you can never read them as they are. Like, you can never take things to mean what they say they mean. There's always an undercurrent of something else that you need to be sensitive enough to pick up and knowledgeable enough to interpret. And if that is the lesson that socialist realism can teach us today, maybe that's not a bad lesson. There's a photo of Peterson standing in front of one of those huge socialist realist war paintings. And in the corner there, you can see into another room, and you can see that it's decorated with Christmas decorations for his kids. Little elf costumes and like little bells and whistles, for Christmas probably, or something like that. And I don't know. It just made me laugh. I really like that. Two worlds clashing. Let me know down below what you think about this. And if you have any links to more information about Jordan Peterson's collection of Socialist Realism, please let me know, because I do find it quite interesting. Yeah. Thank you for watching.